Some places whisper their secrets. Alaska hurls them into the frozen wind and dares you to listen. Out here, the horizon is a knife, and the sky forgets the sun for months at a time. Snow does not fall so much as it settles like a hush over everything you thought you understood. Between breath and blizzard, between Caribou Track and Pressure Ridge, something watches. It waits where civilization thins to a thread and the wilderness pulls. And if you stand still long enough, with the cold gnawing through your boots and the dark pressing at the edges of your pupils, you will feel it too, that prickle at the back of the neck that says the map is a rumor and the rules are optional. Alaska calls itself the last frontier, but that is a polite front. The truth is simpler, crueler. It is a place that keeps score. There are stories that belong only here because nowhere else would dare hold them. A vessel that learned to go on without the hands that built her. A baker with flour on his sleeves and a rifle in his plane who transformed the familiar into the unthinkable. A whole town that decided the mathematics of survival favored flight over faith and slipped into the night, leaving coffee cups with rings of cold at the bottoms and doors that banged in the wind until the hinges gave out. These are not campfire tales. They are entries carved into ledgers, captured in police reports, spoken in the measured tones of people who do not have the luxury of hysteria. These are the kinds of stories that turn skepticism into ritual. Lock the door, stoke the stove, keep your back to the wall. Nothing supernatural about that, only respect. First, there was a ship, born in a Swedish yard of steel and steam and renamed to suit the company that bought her. She wore the labor of the Arctic like a second hull salt crust in her seams, fur bales stacked in her gut, the smell of coal and cold iron following her like a wake. She was supposed to go where men pointed, stop when engines did, crack her way through flows and into warmth on schedule. But in the North, schedules are polite fictions. The SS Baychimo, some called her Baymo in the quick slur of frostbitten lips, became something else after the ice closed its teeth. What do you call a machine that behaves as though it can decide? A rumor, a ghost, or an inconvenient fact witnessed, logged, then abandoned? Because belief is heavier than cargo in waters that eat mistakes whole. As the Baymo began to haunt the white, Anchorage kept its rhythm to a different drum. A city that sells warmth by the cup and nails by the pound. Ordinary in the way that makes the worst things possible. The kind of place where you could nod to a man over a display of pastries and never wonder about the darkness folded neatly behind his smile. Robert Hansen did not look like the bogeyman. He looked like a neighbor who'd offer to fix your fence, who bragged modestly about hunting seasons in a way that made you think he worshipped the land. Maybe he did. Worship comes in many shapes. In Alaska, the wilderness forgives nothing and explains less, and someone like Hansen could use that indifference as both mask and blade. While a ship sailed alone north of the map's Patience, a predator hunted south of it, and the space between the two stories was the size of a state. Then there is Portlock, a town with the kind of beginning that promises decades of small miracles, salmon runs fat with silver, the mechanical grace of fish wheels turning, children learning how to read the weather by smell alone, and then, unspooling like a rope suddenly gone slack, the others, footprints too big for a joke, bodies found where no one should have been, equipment wrecked with a purpose that did not belong to wind or bear. You can call it a legend if it lets you sleep. The people who left did not argue the adjectives. They left, and in their leaving they wrote the final line on the ledger in a script that needs no translation. Fear, multiplied by time, equals an empty town. 3 threads, braided by the same hand, Alaska's. This is not coincidence. It is climate. It is the way distance stretches the moment between question and answer until the question becomes its own answer. Out here, radios sputter and compasses sulk and engines develop sudden principles. Out here, men who think they are kings learn they are bone and breath. Out here, towns understand that the math of survival does not always show its work, and ships, well, sometimes ships forget they were built by us and remember only that they are built to move. You can warm your hands and pretend these are isolated incidents. A phantom vessel, a killer with a private runway of ice, a village that evacuated itself like a body rejecting a toxin. But you would be lying to yourself in a way Alaska does not forgive. The common denominator is not ghosts or madness. It is the geography of indifference. The Arctic Ocean does not care if you believe in it. The winter will come anyway. The spruce tree does not care if you name it. It will crack in the cold when it must. The wind has one job, and it does it without apology. We tell ourselves stories to hide from that indifference, and Sometimes the stories grow teeth. So this is your invitation and your warning. Lock your doors. Turn up the heat, pull the curtains if you must, but know that the darkness on the other side is not empty. It just does not need you. We are going to walk out on the ice and look at a ship that decided crews were optional. We are going to step into a bakery that smells of sugar, while the freezer hums with trophies. We are going to wade through alder and alder and alder to the foundation lines of a town that changed its mind about forever. We won't preach. We will witness. We will follow logbooks and court transcripts and the kinds of footprints that do not fit your boots. We will listen to elders who do not waste words, and to pilots who know how small an airplane really is, above white on white on white. And when we are done, you may not believe more. Belief is a luxury item, but you will know enough to keep your distance from explanations that arrive too quickly. You will understand that unsolved here does not mean forgotten. It means filed under do not touch without gloves. You will taste the iron at the back of your throat. When a radio goes quiet, you will hear the difference between silent and hush, and you will know why some people, having seen what they have seen, stop telling stories altogether. Because sometimes the telling sounds too much like calling something by name, and in Alaska, names carry farther than you think. So welcome to the threshold. The stove is lit. The maps are on the table, edges curled from use. The snow is beginning to whisper against the door. We will begin where men believe they are safe, aboard a vessel with steel bones and a captain's certainty, surrounded by a world that does not sign contracts. We will end where certainty fails in a different register, a town with a post office, and then, suddenly, without one, between those points lies the kind of truth that earns frostbite to hold. After this, you will never see Alaska the same way again. Not because we have changed it, but because it has finally introduced itself. Sit close to the heat, but not too close. Keep one ear on the wind. And if, in the telling, you feel something leaning over your shoulder, do not turn around too quickly. Some stories here prefer to be seen from the corner of the eye. That is how the land offers its lessons sideways, oblique, patient. We are ready when you are. The Baychimo is waiting just beyond the pressure ridge, black against a white that goes on forever. The baker's doorbell is about to ring, and down on the Kenai, empty windows are staring back at the sea. This is Alaska. It keeps its secrets, but it does not keep them quietly. The SS Baychimo was never meant to be a ghost. She was steel and rivets, a vessel born in 1914 in the Swedish yards of Gothenburg, christened with the practical name Angermanelven. She began her life in the smoke of war, handed over as part of German reparations after the Great War. Before finding her true calling under the Hudson's Bay Company, they renamed her the Baychimo. And in that new name, she carried not just cargo, but hope for pelts, provisions, and trade that stitched together the scattered Inuit settlements of the northern coast. For a decade, she was no legend, just a working ship, steady and reliable, one of many that risked the Arctic waters because someone had to picture her, black hull cutting through gray seas, yellow smokestack, a defiant torch against the pale horizon, her holds stacked with fox and mink, the lifeblood of an economy built on survival. She was a trader ship, a lifeline, as honest as the hands that loaded her. Her crew were not explorers seeking glory, but laborers trying to bring warmth to their families. Each voyage was a gamble, but a necessary one. And for a while the Baychimo played by the rules. But the Arctic does not believe in rules. Out here, treaties and timetables crumble like ice in the spring thaw. You can think you have mapped the channels, plotted your course, calculated your risk, but the ice has its own arithmetic. Sometimes it opens a path, sometimes it closes like Jaws. And when it closes, it does so without hesitation, without remorse. The Baychimo was about to learn that truth in the hardest way. It was September 1931, and the season was winding down. The Baychimo had completed her runs, her belly filled with furs bound for Vancouver, her crew eager to beat the winter. They knew the dangers, knew the sea's temper, but near Point Barrow, Alaska, the trap was sprung. The ice did not just creep in. It surged, sudden and merciless, grinding, pushing, lifting the 322-ton steamer as though she were no more than driftwood. Steel groaned, rivets strained, and the crew could only watch as the ocean transformed into a prison. Imagine standing on that deck, hearing the timbers crack like gunfire, watching walls of ice rise higher than your masts. The Baychimo was not sinking. She was being held, gripped by a force older and colder than any captain's logbook. The men had a choice, though in truth it was not a choice at all. They abandoned her. Across the treacherous floes they trudged, carrying what little they could, leaving behind not just their cargo, but the tools of their trade, their personal belongings, and a piece of themselves. In the Arctic, survival always weighs heavier than possession. When they reached Barrow, they thought they had left the Baychimo to her fate, a frozen monument to the unforgiving North. But 2 days later, an Inuit hunter brought them news that made the hairs on their necks stand up. He had seen her 45 miles away sailing free. Stop and imagine the silence in that moment. The ship they had abandoned, the ship entombed by ice, was not where she should have been. She was moving, alive in the water, no crew aboard to explain her rebirth. What does a sailor do when faced with something like that? He tracks it down. And so they did. The Baychimo was found intact, her cargo undisturbed, her engines ready. Relief washed over them like sunlight after storm. They restarted her, and for 13 days they believed they had won. But the Arctic was not done with them. On October 8th, the ice came again. Thicker, harder, hungrier. This time the grip was final. Once more the Baychimo was locked, and this time the Hudson's Bay Company made the call, evacuate. Aircraft ferried the crew to safety, but 15 men volunteered to stay, building a shelter from salvaged boards, huddling close to their captive ship. They thought they could wait it out, thought they could guard what mattered most, the cargo that represented not just wealth but survival, for those who traded it. Then November came, and with it, a storm that felt less like weather and more like wrath. For 3 days, snow fell so thick it erased the sun. Winds screamed like a chorus of furies, and the men clung to their shelter as though the world outside had ceased to exist. When the storm passed, and they emerged, shaken but alive, the Baychimo was gone. Not sunk, not broken. Gone. The sea where she had sat was smooth, undisturbed, as though she had never been there at all. Their conclusion was logical. If grim, the storm had crushed her beneath the ice. A sad ending, but an ending nonetheless. Yet in Alaska, endings are never so clean. 3 months later, the same hunter returned, carrying news like a curse. He had seen her again, alive, afloat, and moving freely 45 miles from where she had vanished. The impossible was now undeniable. The Baychimo was no wreck. She was a wanderer. The crew tracked her one final time. On board, everything was as they had left it. Cargo intact. Personal belongings undisturbed. Ship's log frozen at the moment before the storm. They salvaged what furs they could, then made a choice that would carve the Baychimo's name into legend. They abandoned her permanently. The Hudson's Bay Company collected their insurance, writing her off as a total loss. But the Baychimo had other plans. She was no longer a cargo vessel. She was something else entirely. And in that transformation, she became Alaska's first great phantom. The Baychimo's story could have ended there, abandoned to the ice. Insurance money pocketed, her name fading into the long roll call of ships claimed by the Arctic. But the North is not so merciful. What happened next is what turned a stranded steamer into a legend that would haunt maritime circles for decades. It began with that fateful sighting, the hunter's words still fresh in the minds of men who had already mourned their ship. To see her again, not shattered, not sunk, but moving, was to glimpse the impossible. Imagine the crew's return to her steel decks, the way their boots rang out against the hull that should have been crushed beneath the storm. Their belongings were where they would left them, tools neatly arranged, logbook open, as though awaiting the next entry. The cargo, those precious furs, lay untouched. Everything was ordinary, except for the one fact that eclipsed all others. The Baychimo had sailed herself. For 13 days, they tried to pretend nothing had changed. They coaxed her engines back to life, steered her across waters that had seemed determined to bury her. But on October 8, 1931, the Arctic reminded them who was master. Ice closed in again, more merciless than before. This time, no amount of determination could free her. The ship was trapped once more, walls of white rising around her like prison bars. The Hudson's Bay Company intervened, ordering the evacuation of her crew by air. It was a new era of rescue planes, skimming down to pull men from the grip of ice. Yet 15 souls refused to leave entirely. They built a shack from salvaged boards, hugging close to their vessel like loyal sentinels. They told themselves they could wait out the winter, keep watch over the furs, and protect what little remained of their season's labor. Then came November 24th. The storm that day was no mere storm. For 3 days, the sky collapsed into the sea. Snow fell in sheets so thick that men could not see the hands in front of their faces. The world turned white and black all at once, day erased, night howling with winds that clawed through seams and splintered wood. Inside their shack, the men clung together, every howl of the wind sounding like the tearing of steel. They prayed not for the Baychimo, but for their lives. When silence finally returned, when daylight trickled weakly through the storm's wreckage, they stepped outside and stared into absence. The Baychimo was gone. Where she had stood, locked tight in ice, there was nothing but smooth, frozen sea. No wreckage, no masts protruding like broken bones, no sign of the vessel that had loomed above them only days before. The men searched with eyes that could not comprehend. The conclusion seemed obvious. She had been crushed beneath the ice and dragged to a watery grave. It was a grim but sensible fate, one that fit the merciless arithmetic of the Arctic. But Alaska does not deal in sensible fates. 3 months later, the hunter who had first brought news of her resurrection returned. He had seen her again 45 miles southeast of where she had vanished. Not wrecked, not buried. Sailing. Alone. This second impossibility struck deeper than the first. Once could be explained as luck, as misjudgment. Twice was something else. Twice suggested intent. The crew once again sought her out, their hearts torn between dread and duty. When they boarded, the scene was the same. Cargo undisturbed, personal effects as they had left them. Logbook frozen in time. No evidence of plunder, no sign of another soul. The Baychimo had traveled without them and preserved everything within her steel ribs. It was here, in this moment, that the men made the decision that transformed a ship into a ghost. They salvaged what they could carry, but they did not stay. They abandoned her to the ice and the sea, leaving behind not just a vessel, but a question that would never find its answer. A Hudson's Bay company washed its hands of the matter, declaring her a loss. On paper, she was finished. But the ice and the ocean do not keep to paper. From that moment forward, the Baychimo belonged to the wilderness. She would drift through fog, slip from one patch of ice to another, vanish and reappear where no one expected. Sailors began to speak of her in hushed tones, not as wreckage, but as presence. The Phantom of the Arctic. For the men who had walked away, the image must have lingered for years. A ship that refused to die, a vessel that rejected both her crew and her grave. They had been her masters once, but now they were reduced to witnesses. The Baychimo had made her choice, and it was not them. And so, the stage was set for a haunting unlike any other. This was no Flying Dutchman bound to myth. This was a documented vessel, registered and real, seen again and again by eyes that wrote down what they could not explain. The Arctic had not claimed her. The Arctic had given her back, but not to men. The November storm of 1931 was supposed to write the final chapter of the Baychimo. For the men who had survived it, there was no doubt the vessel had been crushed beneath the shifting ice, dragged down into the black where so many Arctic ships before her had vanished. That conclusion was logical, comforting even, because logic brings closure. Yet the Baychimo had already begun rewriting her own fate, and what came after defied any closure at all. When the Inuit hunter returned months later with news that the ship was alive, drifting once more, it must have felt like a blow to the senses. Imagine being a sailor who had already mourned her, who had accepted the sea's indifference. To then hear she was moving again 45 miles from where she had last been seen was to realize that the storm had not buried her. It had freed her. The crew who tracked her down that winter found her exactly as before, her decks silent, her cargo intact, the log frozen at the last entry before the storm. She had not been scavenged or boarded by opportunists. She had not been battered into wreckage. She was waiting, whole, as though the ice itself had carried her to safety. And yet, when they stood upon those decks, there was an unease no inventory could explain. The Baychimo had moved without them once, and now again. A ship does not sail herself. Engines need tending. Wheels need hands. The sea does not carry steel giants, without reason. But the Baychimo seemed indifferent to reason. She was proof of something no sailor wished to believe, that in the Arctic, even machines might learn to live by their own rules. The men salvaged what they could. Then they walked away for the last time, leaving her to the winds and the white horizon. In doing so, they gave her to legend. What followed in the years to come was a pattern that made the Baychimo less a ship than a phantom, stitched into the very fabric of Arctic lore. Again and again, hunters, trappers, and ship captains spotted her in places she had no right to be. She was seen drifting through open leads in the ice, sliding silently past settlements, her smokestack rising like a warning tower against the snow. Some claimed she adjusted course when ice fields threatened, steering herself through passages as though guided by an unseen helmsman. Others swore she changed speed, slowing in storms, quickening when the waters were clear. How could such things be? Ships are not birds to sense the air, not whales to know the currents. Yet the Baychimo behaved as though she possessed her own will, as if the November storm had shaken something awake inside her steel bones. In March 1933, the story deepened into something more impossible. A group of Inupiat hunters, caught in a calm moment, boarded her in the Chukchi Sea. They found her as every crewman before them had, cargo untouched, equipment functional, quarters abandoned yet frozen in time. But unlike others, they chose to stay. They camped aboard her, believing they could wait until salvage crews arrived. For 10 days, they lived inside her echoing hull. Those 10 days became testimony no skeptic could easily dismiss. The hunter swore the Baychimo did not drift aimlessly. She moved with intent, slipping through ice fields that should have crushed her, steering clear of floes that broke weaker ships. In storms, she held course, almost protective of the lives unwillingly entrusted to her. And then, just as suddenly, she delivered them back to shore, miles from where they had first boarded, safe but shaken. What kind of ship carries men without a crew? What kind of machine chooses its path as though aware? The Hudson's Bay Company refused to entertain such questions. To them, the Baychimo was a loss written off, a steel corpse adrift in waters that swallowed evidence. Officially, she was gone, but the reports kept coming. Each sighting chipped away at reason. Captains logged her presence with precise details. Her distinctive hull, her yellow stack, her markings. These were not vague tales spun over rum. These were records from men whose reputations depended on accuracy. And each time, she slipped away again, vanishing into fog or ice, as though she knew when men sought her. There is a saying among northern hunters, the land decides when you see it. Perhaps the same could be said for the Baychimo. She appeared not when she was sought, but when she chose, gifting herself to those who would later whisper her story by firelight. The November storm had not ended her, it had transformed her. From that moment forward, the Baychimo was no longer cargo vessel, no longer property of company or crew. She was something else, something that belonged only to the Arctic itself. And once a ship becomes legend, no storm, no ice, no ledger can contain her. By 1932, whispers of the Baychimo had spread beyond the ice. She was no longer a ship lost to circumstance. She was an apparition woven into maritime reports, her sightings stacking like layers of frost. Each account carried the same eerie refrain. She moved when she should not have, she endured when she should have broken, and she sailed where no crew guided her. To the Inuit hunters who lived close to the pulse of the Arctic, she was less a mystery than a sign. They knew the land could keep what it wished, and release what it chose. Yet even they watched her with wary eyes. Steel was not meant to breathe, and yet the Baychimo carried herself as if lungs beat within her hull. The most chilling testimony came from the Inupiat hunters who spent 10 days trapped aboard her in 1933. They had boarded her when the sea lay calm, planning to salvage what the company had abandoned. But then the ice shifted, and the storm descended, stranding them within her cold corridors. For 10 nights, they listened as the ship groaned against the weight of ice, yet never cracked. They swore the Baychimo moved with purpose, her bulk sliding through channels that seemed to open just for her, avoiding collisions with floes that should have torn her steel apart. Picture it, lying awake in a ship with no crew, lantern light flickering on rusted walls, listening to the creak of timbers bending against forces unseen. Each sound would have been indistinguishable from a living thing, like the ship herself was breathing, deciding, choosing. Some of the hunters described her as protective, carrying them away from danger, with the instinct of a guide. Others whispered she was restless, seeking something in the endless expanse, using them as unwilling passengers in a voyage not meant for men. When at last she delivered them to safety, the hunters left with more than survival. They carried a story that confirmed what sailors had been whispering. The Baychimo was not simply drifting. She was alive in a way that defied every law of machine and sea. From then on, sightings took on the cadence of folklore but remained anchored in fact. Radio operators logged her position, ship captains filed reports, even pilots began noting her from the sky. Always the same, an intact vessel, no smoke from her stack, no figures on her deck, yet unmistakably moving, as if guided by some invisible hand. And each attempt to claim her, to bring her back to the world of men, failed. Salvage crews found themselves thwarted by sudden fogs that rolled in from cloudless skies. Ice shifted with unnatural speed, cutting off approach routes. Compasses faltered, engines sputtered, and when the obstacles cleared, the Baychimo was gone, slipped away, as though she had been listening. This was no passive wreck. This was a ship that resisted capture. It is here that her legend crystallized into something more than a ghost story. A drifting vessel can be explained by currents, by ice flows, by the natural push and pull of Arctic seas. But a ship that evades pursuit, that seems to anticipate rescue and then disappear, that is no longer accident. That is intent. Some seafarers began to treat her with reverence. They believed the Baychimo carried the spirits of ships claimed by the ice, that within her hull resided a knowledge older than charts. She was an ark for the lost, forever sailing the margins of the known. Others feared her as a curse. They told tales of crews who grew obsessed with finding her, only to vanish themselves. To chase the Baychimo, they said, was to tempt the same fate, to be swallowed by the Arctic and never return. But all agreed on one thing. The Baychimo had become something beyond steel and rivets. She was no longer a vessel. She was a presence. The Hudson's Bay Company stopped acknowledging her altogether, unwilling to legitimize what official records called impossible. But impossibility was the Baychimo's only law. Through the 1930s and into the decades that followed, she continued her wanderings, slipping in and out of human sight like a shadow at the edge of a campfire. Each new report deepened the divide between explanation and experience. Scientists spoke of ice lift and atmospheric illusions. Hunters spoke of spirits and restless souls. Sailors spoke of a ship that knew too much. And in every story, one detail remained constant. The Baychimo was still out there, choosing her own path. In the end, she was less ghost and more mirror, reflecting the fear, wonder, and smallness of every human who laid eyes upon her. For some, she was proof of mystery. For others, proof of madness. But for all, she was undeniable. The Baychimo was no longer lost. She was awake. As the 1930s bled into the following decades, the Baychimo's legend swelled like the tide, forcing experts, sailors, and storytellers alike to wrestle with the impossible. Reports of her sighting stacked higher than the snowdrifts along Alaska's frozen coastlines. She had become more than a ship. She was a paradox, a contradiction wrapped in steel. And humanity, desperate for explanations, began inventing them. Naval architects, men of math and measure, offered the ice lift theory. They argued that the Baychimo's steel hull was strong enough to withstand what destroyed wooden ships. Instead of being crushed, she could be lifted and carried by massive floes across miles of ice. Under perfect conditions, a vessel her size could be transported like a child's toy atop a moving glacier. It was neat. It was logical. But it shattered against the accounts of those who saw her cutting through open water, adjusting course as if guided by an invisible hand. Ice could move her, yes, but ice could not steer. Conspiracy theorists, never content with silence, claimed she had been claimed in secret. Some whispered that Soviet intelligence operatives had seized her, using her as a covert reconnaissance ship hidden beneath the shroud of a ghost story. Others pointed at American intelligence, arguing that no better camouflage existed than a vessel everyone dismissed as a phantom. In this view, the Baychimo was no mystery at all, but a pawn in the games of men. Yet the theory fell apart under scrutiny. Steam engines need fuel. Crews need food. Covert operations leave traces. None were found. The Baychimo never sent coded signals, never left trails of supply, never showed signs of human maintenance. For the Inuit elders, the explanation was both simpler and older. They said the Baychimo had absorbed the spirits of the countless ships claimed by the ice. She was no longer mere steel, but a vessel of memory, carrying the knowledge of the lost. To them, her ability to appear and disappear was no trick of ice or storm. It was her will. She revealed herself when she chose, and to those she chose. Her furs, rotting but still sealed in her hold, were not just cargo, but offerings, tributes that bound her to the spirit world. Others turned inward, insisting the Baychimo was not real at all, but a hallucination born of the Arctic's merciless isolation. Endless horizons, brutal cold, weeks of sunless night conditions known to crack the edges of the mind. Men had seen phantom islands before, ships shimmering in mirages that danced above the ice. Could the Baychimo be nothing more than a collective madness, reinforced by stories, until it felt like truth? A psychiatrist named Drive, Elizabeth Hawthorne, proposed exactly that, calling it Arctic-induced psychosis, a shared delusion that made men see what they most feared or most desired. But her theory fractured against the testimony of the hunters, who spent 10 days aboard the vessel, touching her steel, smelling her rotting cargo, walking her empty decks. Hallucinations do not leave footprints on iron. Then came the scientists of the sky, who turned to the atmosphere for answers. They spoke of temperature inversions and mirages, the strange alchemy of light bending across the Arctic, projecting images from miles away. Perhaps those who swore they saw the Baychimo were glimpsing her final resting place, reflected across the horizon like a ghost in a mirror. But again, the theory failed when tested against her behavior. Mirages do not change course. Mirages do not dodge ice. Every explanation cracked under pressure, leaving something raw in its place, the possibility that the Baychimo was exactly what she appeared to be, a ship that had shrugged off human ownership and decided her fate was her own. The Hudson's Bay Company, embarrassed by the constant reports, eventually chose silence. In their records, she was abandoned, not destroyed. A bureaucratic concession that said more than they intended. They could not declare her sunk because no proof of sinking existed. They could not call her found because no one could hold her. So they left her in the liminal space she seemed to prefer, neither here nor gone, a permanent resident of the in-between. Meanwhile, among sailors, the Baychimo took on the weight of warning. To glimpse her was to be reminded of how fragile human control really was. Some captains claimed she brought luck, a guardian presence in seas where death lurked in every flow. Others swore she was an omen, that to see her was to invite disaster. What united them all was a sense of unease, the feeling that a boundary had been crossed. Ships were supposed to need men. The Baychimo proved otherwise. By the mid-20th century, her story had grown so entangled with fear and fascination that she was no longer just a ghost ship. She was Alaska itself made manifest, the state where rules bent, where wilderness whispered louder than civilization, where survival was not promised but borrowed, briefly, from forces beyond comprehension. The Baychimo, whatever name her witnesses used, had become more than a vessel. She was the question that could not be answered, the equation that refused to balance, the story that even skeptics repeated with lowered voices. Because deep down, every man who went north understood, if steel can wake, if a ship can choose, then perhaps nothing in Alaska is as certain as it seems. By the late 1930s, the Baychimo was no longer just a rumor whispered in mess halls or Inuit camps. She was a constant presence in Arctic lore, a ship that refused both death and ownership. Hunters saw her drift past ice ridges, under skies that promised storms. Captains logged her in their charts with reluctant ink, fearing ridicule but fearing more the weight of a lie. Pilots flying new Arctic routes peered down through frosted windows to glimpse her hull gliding over the white deck as empty as a coffin's lid. The sightings came in irregular patterns, scattered across years and hundreds of miles, but they shared one truth: she moved with purpose. A derelict vessel should drift with currents, stumble into shoals, break against ice, and vanish. But the Baychimo endured, not simply surviving, evading. Time and again, salvage crews attempted to capture her that would chart her last reported position, gather equipment, and set off into the ice. And time and again, something interfered. Clear skies dissolved into sudden fog, swallowing her silhouette in a curtain of white. Ice fields shifted without warning, slamming closed channels that had been open hours before. Engines coughed, compasses spun, radios went silent, and when the chaos cleared, the Baychimo was gone. It became a pattern too consistent to dismiss as chance. It was as if the ship herself was listening, as if she sensed pursuit and refused it. Why, then, had she allowed hunters to live aboard her for 10 days in 1933? Why had she shown herself so often to ordinary trappers, pilots, and fishermen, but denied every organized expedition? Some said she tolerated those who respected her, but fled from those who sought to claim her. Others whispered she was testing witnesses, choosing whose stories she wanted told. Through the 1940s, 1950s, and into the 1960s, the Baychimo remained an apparition at the edge of maps. Her decks were seen weathered but intact, her hull scarred yet unbroken. Some witnesses described her as spectral, appearing out of fog only to vanish again, as though melting into the horizon. Others swore she responded to storms like a living creature, veering away from danger in ways no drifting wreck could manage. By 1969, the legend reached its final documented act. Inuit hunters spotted her once more, locked in pack ice in the Beaufort Sea. She looked the same as always, silent, intact, abandoned. For 38 years she had sailed without a crew, slipping through the Arctic like a ghost that could never be exorcised. After that sighting, she vanished completely from maritime records. The decades that followed brought the modern age, satellites orbiting above, radar scanning beneath, aircraft tracing every inch of the north. If she had still been wandering, surely she would have been found. But the Baychimo left no wreckage, no bones of steel resting on the ocean floor, no scattered debris on the ice. She simply disappeared, as though she had finally chosen her own end. In 2006, the Alaskan government mounted a comprehensive search. They scanned over 50 square miles with satellites and ice-penetrating radar, uncovering the remains of dozens of ships long claimed by the Arctic. Whaling vessels, trappers, schooners, nameless wrecks littered the seabed like fossils, but not the Baychimo. Of her, there was no sign, not a rivet, not a plate, not a shadow beneath the ice. It was the perfect ending to a story that had defied endings all along. To declare her sunk was unsatisfying. To insist she still sailed was impossible. She had outlived her crew, her owners, and even her pursuers. When the age of technology came to find her, she denied even that. The Baychimo had transcended fact. She was legend now, not because she was unexplainable, but because she had chosen not to be explained. A ship that became more than steel, a ghost that outlived those who told her story. And as her name faded from official ledgers, Alaska offered a darker reminder. If a ship could wear the mask of a phantom, what about a man? For while the Baychimo slipped into myth, another shadow was rising in Anchorage. Not a vessel with no crew, but a baker with too many secrets. A man who used flour and sugar as camouflage while hunting, prey far more chilling than any phantom on the sea. The ghost ship had left the stage. The butcher baker was about to step onto it. Anchorage in the 1970s looked nothing like the desolate white wilderness where the Baychimo had carved her legend. Here, the hum of commerce replaced the silence of ice. Cafes served hot coffee to men fresh off the oil fields. Children trudged to school through half-cleared snow. And neighbors nodded to one another with the kind of trust small communities need to survive. It was a city that felt grounded, predictable, safe, and in the heart of this safety was a man who embodied it perfectly. Robert Hansen. A baker, a husband, a father of two, the kind of man whose name people said with a half-smile, Bob the Baker. He owned a successful shop, he decorated cakes, kneaded dough, and handed warm bread across counters to women who never imagined the hands that dusted flour in the morning would be shackled for murder years later. On paper, Hansen was the American dream, small-town edition. His reputation stretched beyond the bakery, too. He was a skilled outdoorsman, a hunter who broke records and hung trophies proudly. He knew Alaska's wilderness as well as any trapper or pilot, boasting kills that made other hunters nod with envy. To most, he was the kind of man who represented stability, tradition, the frontier spirit, but under that veneer of civility lay scars carved deep in adolescence. Hansen had grown up a shy, awkward boy, mocked for his stutter, his acne, his hunched posture. Girls rejected him with cruelty that festered into hatred. Boys laughed at him in ways that hardened into rage. He carried these wounds into adulthood, like frostbite that never healed, hiding them beneath smiles and loaves of bread. Those who knew him only casually never saw the fracture lines, but cracks had already shown years before Anchorage came to know him. As a teenager, Hansen set fire to a school bus garage, confessing later it was revenge against the place that had humiliated him. He served 20 months for arson, but the punishment did little more than teach him patience. He was arrested again for petty theft, later for assault, even attempted rape, yet time and again he slipped through the system's grasp, serving shortened sentences, walking free when others might have rotted in cells. By 1971, Anchorage thought they knew him, a baker, a hunter, a neighbor. But the truth was already far darker. Beneath the apron and the friendly nod lived fantasies that had metastasized into something lethal. He no longer wanted to shoot moose or bear. His prey had shifted. He began hunting women. Not in daylight, not in neighborhoods. Hansen's hunts began with deception. He targeted women he believed society would not miss: dancers, sex workers, women who lived at the margins. He would lure them with promises, sometimes with money, sometimes with threats, sometimes with sheer force. And once he had them, the mask of the baker slipped away. They were brought first to his home, where he subjected them to assault and humiliation. But Hansen's true theater of cruelty was the wilderness. There, he was no baker. He was the predator he had always fantasized of being. He flew victims in his small Piper Super Cub, lifting off from runways where no one questioned the quiet man with hunting records and a pilot's license. His destinations were remote patches of tundra, dense forests, desolate riverbanks, places only a hunter could navigate. There, in the silence of Alaska's vastness, he unleashed his most monstrous ritual. He would set the women loose, forcing them to run, to stumble through brush and snow, believing for a moment they might escape. But Hansen carried a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. He carried knives. He carried the patience of a man who had hunted moose, now applied to terrified human prey. Picture the terror of those moments. Lungs burning in the cold, feet sinking in snow, every sound behind you magnified until the snap of a twig sounds like the end. To be prey is to know death is already close. To be prey in Alaska is to know death has all the advantages. For Hansen, it was not about the kill. It was about reclaiming power he believed the world had denied him. Each shot was vengeance, each body a grotesque trophy he buried in the earth like offerings. He confessed later to 4 murders. Authorities believe the true count was at least 17, perhaps more than 20. Over 30 women survived his abductions, but the wilderness still hides the bones of those who never returned. Anchorage never saw this side of him. Neighbors saw the baker dusted in flour, not the hunter wiping blood from his hands. Customers saw a polite man with a stutter, not the predator mapping remote burial sites. His camouflage was perfect because it was ordinary. While the Baychimo had been a ghost of steel haunting the ice, Hansen was a ghost in flesh haunting the city itself. He lived among them, invisible not because he could not be seen, but because no one wanted to look too closely at the man who seemed so harmless. In Alaska, the wilderness swallows ships whole, erases towns from the map. But Robert Hansen proved something even more terrifying. Sometimes the wilderness teaches its cruelty to men, and men carry it home. If the Baychimo's mystery lay in her defiance of natural law, Robert Hansen's horror came from how perfectly he obeyed it. Predators stalk prey. They study, they test, they corner, they strike. Hansen's difference was only in choice of quarry. He looked at human beings, at women's society, refused to protect, and saw game. The pattern was chillingly consistent. He would drive the streets of Anchorage, finding women who worked in strip clubs or on street corners. Many of them lived fragile lives, tangled in poverty or addiction, often without family nearby. They were, in Hansen's eyes, expendable. He would lure them into his car with promises of money or a ride, and once inside, his trap closed. A gun pressed to their ribs, handcuffs around their wrists. His stutter, once a marker of vulnerability, now sharpened the terror, his halting words laced with menace. At first, he brought them to his modest family home. The place looked ordinary, flour-dusted counters, children's toys, photos on the wall. But in the basement, Hansen chained and abused his captives, stripping them not just of freedom but of dignity. These were rehearsals, the prelude to what he truly craved. Then came the flight. Hansen owned a small Piper Super Cub, perfect for slipping away, unnoticed into the immensity of Alaska. He loaded his victims like freight, sometimes gagged, sometimes blindfolded, and lifted them in disguise where no one could hear their screams over the roar of the propeller. Below stretched a wilderness vast enough to hide 100 sins. Landing on gravel bars or frozen clearings, he would drag them from the plane and force them to run. Picture the desperation, stumbling in shoes not made for snow, lungs tearing at the cold air, the awful clarity that you were no longer a woman, but quarry. Behind you, Hansen, rifle in hand, steady, patient. He had hunted moose, bear, sheep. He knew how prey moved. When terrified, he savored it. Some women tried to plead, to reason, to promise silence if only he let them go. But Hansen was deaf to bargaining. Others ran until exhaustion dropped them to their knees, and then the bullet came. A few fought, lunging at him in blind fury, but his knife answered. Each kill was both ritual and revenge. To him, it was payback for years of humiliation. To the world, it was slaughter hidden in the snow. Bodies were left in remote places, where wolves and bears completed the erasure. Some he buried, marking the sites with an X on an aeronautical map he kept hidden in his attic, a hunter's ledger of human lives. When investigators finally uncovered it years later, the chart showed 37 marks scattered across Alaska's wilderness. Each mark a story ended. Each X a woman whose name might never be known. For a decade, Anchorage police struggled. Women disappeared without witnesses, without bodies, without clear evidence. They were women easy for society to dismiss. Runaways, some said, drifters. The truth was darker. They had been abducted by a man no one suspected. Hansen's camouflage was perfect because it was ordinary. He was a baker, a business owner, a father. He hunted legally, attended church, paid taxes. In broad daylight, he was the neighbor who loaned you sugar. At night, he was a shadow with a plane and a rifle. One survivor, a dancer named Cindy Paulson, would later recall the nightmare of being chained in his basement, assaulted, then loaded into his car. She escaped only because Hansen made a mistake, leaving her momentarily unattended. Barefoot, still cuffed, she bolted from his vehicle and flagged down a truck. Her testimony, filled with detail about his appearance, his plane, his basement, would become the turning point. But before her escape, dozens of women had vanished into Alaska's vastness, their voices silenced by snow and time. Hansen confessed to only 4 murders, but investigators believe he killed at least 17, likely more. The true number may never be known. Alaska's wilderness is too vast, too merciless. Bones disappear beneath moss. Rivers grind them to sand. The land swallows secrets whole. Imagine standing in those forests today, the spruce towering overhead, the silence pressing in. Somewhere beneath your boots could lie a fragment of bone, a relic of Hansen's hunts. A reminder that beneath the postcard beauty, the wilderness keeps its darkest bargains. The Baychimo story unsettled because a ship seemed to move of its own will. Hansen's story terrifies because it strips away excuses. He was no ghost, no myth. He was flesh and blood, hidden in plain sight. The monster was not out there on the ice. He was serving bread across the counter. Cindy Paulson's escape on June 13, 1983, was like a crack splitting the ice, sudden, jagged, impossible to ignore. Barefoot, still bound in handcuffs, she stumbled into the street, waving desperately until a passing truck stopped. Her words tumbled out in a blur of terror. A man with a stutter, a baker, a hunter, who had chained her, assaulted her, and planned to fly her deep into the wilderness, to hunt her like an animal. At first, even the police struggled to believe her. The story sounded too outrageous, too cinematic. A respectable family man, a business owner, a trophy hunter, secretly conducting his own murderous safaris. It seemed implausible, yet Paulson's description was precise. She noted the model of the plane. She described the basement. She recalled the weapons. She gave details too sharp, too consistent to dismiss. And so investigators began to look more closely at Robert Hansen, the quiet baker of Anchorage. What they found beneath his facade was a web of red flags that, in hindsight, seemed impossible to have ignored. His prior arrest for abduction and attempted rape, his brief prison sentence that ended in early release, his reputation as a loner despite his family and business, his obsession with hunting. The FBI brought in profiler John E. Douglas, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling. Douglas studied the cases of missing women, Paulson's account, and Hansen's background. His profile was chillingly accurate. The suspect would be an experienced hunter, socially awkward, rejected by women in his youth, harboring deep resentment, and likely keeping trophies from his crimes. Hansen fit the description like a glove. Armed with this insight, investigators secured a search warrant. On October 27, 1983, they raided Hansen's home, bakery, and private property. What they uncovered stripped away every last shred of his disguise. In the attic, they found jewelry rings, necklaces, trinkets belonging to missing women. Each piece was a silent scream, a fragment of life stolen and cataloged. Hidden with the jewelry was an arsenal, guns, knives, weapons meticulously maintained. And then came the most damning evidence of all, an aeronautical chart, marked with 37 tiny X's scattered across Alaska's wilderness. Each mark represented a burial site, a grave, hidden beneath moss and snow. Investigators realized with horror that they held a map of human hunting grounds. The discoveries gave the lie to Hansen's mask of normalcy. The baker's apron, the hunting trophies, the quiet stutter, none of it mattered against the cold precision of the evidence. The jewelry tied him to victims. The weapons matched ballistics. The chart revealed a scope of crimes far beyond his confessions. When confronted with the avalanche of proof, Hansen's carefully constructed facade collapsed. He confessed, detailing abductions, assaults, and murders. Yet even in confession, he minimized, admitting to 4 killings while investigators suspected many more. The X's on the map told a story that numbers could not. 37 marks. 37 women. Some graves were later discovered. Others remained lost in Alaska's endless sprawl. The shock rippled through Anchorage like a blizzard. Neighbors who had bought bread from Hansen were horrified. Friends who had hunted alongside him recoiled. Customers who remembered his polite nods struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster revealed. The betrayal was not just in the murders, but in the deception that evil had worn such a convincing mask of normal life. Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison, a sentence as cold and merciless as the wilderness he had used for his crimes. He would never again stalk the tundra, never again load a rifle with the thrill of hunting prey that begged for mercy. Alaska's courts had closed the chapter, yet the land itself had not, because the wilderness still held secrets. Many of Hansen's victims were never found. Their bones, scattered or buried, remained somewhere beneath the endless spruce and frozen rivers, hidden by the very land that enabled Hansen's hunts. For every X on his map without a recovered body, there is a ghost left wandering Alaska's silence. The story of Robert Hansen was not just about one man's cruelty. It was about how a community could be lulled into blindness, how the ordinary could mask the monstrous. While the Baychimo had unsettled sailors by moving without men, Hansen unsettled an entire city by hiding his darkness beneath the trappings of an ordinary life. Anchorage would never look at its wilderness the same way again. The vast tundra that once symbolized freedom and opportunity had been twisted into a killing field. The man who used it was gone, locked away forever. But the silence he left behind still echoes in the trees, in the gravel bars, in the frozen rivers where women once ran for their lives. If a ship could wake and sail without a crew, and if a baker could hunt humans in the guise of normal life, what else might Alaska be hiding? When Robert Hansen's crimes finally came to light, Alaska reeled not only at the scope of his violence, but at the questions his story raised. How could an ordinary man become something so monstrous? How could a community trust a neighbor who was secretly mapping graves in the wilderness? The explanations, like those offered for the Baychimo, multiplied, each trying to contain the horror within the limits of human understanding. Psychologists called it the compensatory fantasy theory. They argued that Hansen's adolescence, lonely, mocked for his stutter, rejected by women, left him fractured. His hunts, they said, were elaborate revenge fantasies, attempts to rewrite his own history. Each abduction was a twisted act of rewriting the past, where he, no longer humiliated, controlled everything. He had been powerless as a boy, but as a man with a rifle, he could decide who lived and who died. Others pointed to the wilderness itself. Alaska is vast, remote, indifferent. The geographic amplification theory suggested that Hansen's crimes were made possible, even encouraged, by the land. In a city, bodies are found, crimes investigated, killers caught. In Alaska, the land itself becomes an accomplice. Hundreds of square miles offered him hunting grounds where no one would interrupt, where evidence vanished beneath snow and time. Without that wilderness, perhaps Hansen's fantasies would have remained just that. With it, they became his reality. Criminologists examined his trophies, the jewelry, the tokens he collected. This was the trophy collector theory. At first, those trinkets were souvenirs, proof that his fantasies had become real. But over time, they became triggers, mementos he used to relive the thrill. Each piece of jewelry in his attic was a story, a scream, a moment of power preserved. Yet trophies, like hunger, never satisfied for long. They drove him to hunt again and again. Escalation, as predictable as it was, horrifying. And then there was the mask. Investigators called it camouflage. The occupational cover theory. Hansen was not a drifter, not a loner lurking in shadows. He was a baker, a small business owner, a family man. The role of Bob the Baker was not separate from his predatory life. It was part of it. Customers smiled. Police overlooked him. Neighbors nodded in trust. His ordinariness was his shield, the apron and the bread, as effective as any weapon. But perhaps the most chilling theory was about his choice of victims. Hansen did not target wealthy tourists or respected townspeople. He chose sex workers, dancers, women, living on society's margins. Victim selection pathology theory revealed his cruelty was not random. He chose women whom the world already undervalued, whose disappearances were easy to dismiss. In his mind, they were disposable, already marked by society as lesser. By targeting them, he magnified his own twisted sense of superiority. He was not just killing, he was punishing, feeding a hatred rooted in his adolescence. Some experts spoke of criminal evolution. Hansen's path from arsonist to thief, to sexual predator, to murderer was not unique. Many killers escalate in this way, testing boundaries, emboldened when punishments fall short. Hansen had been arrested before for abduction and assault, even sentenced to prison, yet released early. Each leniency became fuel. Each overlooked crime a message. You can go further. By the time the pattern was recognized, dozens of women were gone. The aeronautical chart found in his attic remained the most haunting artifact of all. 37 X's. Each one a grave, a life ended. For investigators, the map was both roadmap and confession. They searched site after site, uncovering bodies long hidden, yet many X's remain unexplored, the wilderness too vast, too unforgiving to yield all its secrets. Even today, hunters stumble across remains, raising the question, is this one of Hansen's lost victims, another story marked by an X? Forensic psychiatrists studied him, hoping to peel back the layers. Some said he killed to reclaim power. Others argued he killed because killing became a ritual, a cycle he could not escape. Whatever the theory, one fact remained. Hansen was a predator who learned to wear human skin convincingly enough to pass as neighbor, father, businessman. He was the reminder that the monsters we fear most are not always hiding in the forest. They are sometimes baking bread across the street. And yet, despite his confession, despite the jewelry, the weapons, the map, Hansen left behind questions that will never be answered. How many women truly died by his hand? How many X's remain undiscovered graves? How many stories ended in silence beneath the spruce? The courts gave him 461 years, but Alaska gave him something more enduring. Legend. Not the kind that inspires awe, like the Baychimos, but the kind that chills blood, whispered in the same breath as "do not walk alone at night." The Baychimo had defied nature. Hansen had embodied it. Both haunted Alaska, one on the sea, one on land, one with silence, one with screams. Together they prove that Alaska's mysteries are not only about ice and storms, but about the fragile line between civilization and wilderness, between human and monster. And if a ship could slip from grasp for decades, if a man could kill for years unnoticed, what about an entire community? What happens when not just one vessel or one predator vanishes into legend, but a whole town? On the southern edge of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, where spruce forests lean into restless waters, stood the town of Portlock. In its early years, it looked like so many frontier settlements, hard-working, remote, alive with the rhythm of fishing and canning. The salmon ran thick in the rivers, the fish wheels turned steady, and Russian Aleut families built homes where smoke curled from chimneys and children's laughter rang across the shoreline. It should have endured. It should have grown, generation after generation. But by 1950, Portlock was silent. The post office shuttered, houses abandoned, nets left to rot. An entire town had vanished, swallowed not by storm or fire, but by fear. The stories that seeped out of Portlock's bones were not about economic decline alone, though those forces surely played a part. They were about something larger, something older, something that left footprints too big to belong to any man. Residents spoke of the Nantinak, a creature half man, half beast that prowled the forests and riversides. Bigfoot-like, they called it. But fiercer, more deliberate, it did not merely lurk, it destroyed. Fish wheels smashed to pieces, hunters vanishing, their bodies later found mutilated in ways no bear or wolf could be blamed for. The accounts date back further than the 1940s. In 1905, the settlement had briefly been abandoned once already, workers fleeing something in the woods, only to return a year later when necessity outweighed dread. But the final exodus, decades later, was different. One by one, families packed what they could, leaving furniture, dishes, even clothes behind. Some fled under cover of darkness, boarding boats without a word to neighbors. By the time outsiders realized what had happened, Portlock was a ghost. Eyewitnesses described chilling details. A schoolteacher recalled hunters who disappeared, only for one body to be found ripped open near a lagoon. In 1931, a woodchopper was discovered slain by a single blow so powerful it could not have been delivered by human hands. Hunters found footprints pressed deep into mud and snow, measuring 18 inches long. They followed the prints for a time, but they always led back into the forest, into shadows no man dared enter. And then there was the silence. Silence thicker than snow. Silence that crept into homes and pressed against windows. Residents said the woods around Portlock felt wrong, heavy, as if watched. Fear settled over the community not as rumor, but as a daily presence, until the choice was no longer whether to believe in the Nantinak, but whether to stay alive. Authorities never mounted a full investigation. By the time news of the abandonment spread, the community had already dissolved. The wilderness had reclaimed its edges, scattering what evidence might have existed. What remained were stories, and the raw fact that an entire settlement had chosen exile over existence. Theories multiplied in the decades that followed. Some argued it was simply economics, the salmon runs weakening, jobs dwindling, new highways pulling families to more prosperous towns. Yet if economics alone explained Portlock, why the suddenness? Why the stories of bodies torn apart, of footprints no human could match? Wildlife biologists suggested the culprit was a massive predator, perhaps a rogue bear, unusually aggressive. A short-faced bear, thought extinct for millennia, was even proposed as a candidate, its size and strength fitting the wounds described, but no bones, no carcasses, no proof has ever been found. Psychologists offered another idea: mass hysteria. In isolated communities, fear can be contagious. A missing hunter becomes a murdered one. A large track becomes evidence of a monster. Anxiety feeds on itself until it drives even rational people to flee. Could Portlock have been undone not by claws but by imagination, perhaps? Yet the abandoned homes, the personal belongings left behind, speak of fear too urgent for slow hysteria. Anthropologists turned to history. The Aleut had long told stories of spirits in the forest, beings that punished humans for overstepping bounds. Perhaps Portlock had been haunted not by a physical beast, but by a spiritual reckoning. The Nantinak in this view was no creature of flesh, but of belief, a legend powerful enough to scatter a town. And then there are the interdimensional theorists, those who argue the Kenai Peninsula is a thin place, where the veil between worlds falters. They claim the Nantiak slipped through, only sometimes visible, its violence a symptom of crossing between realities. Outlandish, perhaps, but in the face of Portlock's silence, no theory can be fully dismissed. What is certain is this: Portlock remains abandoned. Houses sagging into earth, timbers grayed by salt wind. The forest creeps closer every year, swallowing streets and foundations. Tourists and paranormal researchers visit, but none stay. The fear that drove the residents away still hangs in the air, as palpable as the smell of seaweed on the tide. Today, Portlock's story stands alongside that of the Baychimo and Robert Hansen, forming a trinity of Alaskan mysteries. A ship that sailed without men, a man who hunted as though he were beast, a town that chose to vanish rather than face what stalked it. Each story alone is chilling. Together, they weave a portrait of Alaska itself, a land where civilization frays at the edges, where wilderness seeps in, and where the impossible feels uncomfortably close. The Baychimo's decks are gone now, swallowed by sea or ice, but her legend sails on. Robert Hansen died in prison in 2014, but his X-marked map still whispers of graves unfound. Portlock stands empty, its silence louder than any confession. These mysteries share one truth: Alaska does not give up its secrets easily. Ships are meant to rust. Men are meant to be unmasked. Towns are meant to endure. And yet in Alaska, a ship became immortal, a man became myth, and a town became a memory. So when the wind howls across the Kenai, or when fog swallows the horizon whole, ask yourself, what else hides in the spaces we do not look? What waits in forests unwalked, in waters unmapped, in silences unbroken? Alaska does not whisper its secrets. It screams them and dares us to listen.